All right, I see a couple of additional folks joining here. Why don't we get started? Thanks for those of you who joined on time. I'm Mark Jaffe, VP Strategy at Elusive. If you've joined our webinar series before, you know this should be informational, hopefully, and fun. And so I welcome you. Thanks for joining today. Joining me is Jack Pollard of ESG. Say hi, Jack.
Hello, folks. Nice to be here, Mark. Thank you.
Jack, we've been talking about doing this webinar for a bit. We've been talking about sort of this problem of around what you at ESG called the identity security paradox, and we've had some fun discussions thinking about how security teams need to sort of recognize that a lot of the threat out there is moved to identity. So after talking about it for so long, I think it's finally fun to be here. Jack, I'll tell you, I'll share everybody this sort of perspective. Jack, as an analyst at ESG, is it's not only deep, I would say, Jack, in identity, but also you bring sort of a really strong technical understanding of how attackers behave. And so I think that's one of the reasons I think you and I have had such fun conversations. You get it, man, you get it. And I'm hoping that the audience will agree that you can bring some interesting value today. And so again, I thank you for joining.
Thank you.
Wade, we've done webinars before, haven't we? For those of you who haven't met Wade, I'm sorry, Wade, I didn't even let you answer the question, but Wade Lance, Field CTO, as I regularly share, I'm just really impressed, Wade, with the kind of sort of network you've established and trust you've established with CISOs, both in the US and overseas, and kind of the respect you've gotten from them over the years based on the guidance that they've entrusted you with. So that same kind of guidance I think you've provided them is also valued here, and we really appreciate your insights. And thanks for joining us today.
Absolutely. Thanks, Mark. And hey, Jack, good to see you again. Looking forward to the discussion. It's always a pleasure to hang out with Jack and talk trends in cyber. So here we go.
All right, let's stop talking about it. Let's do it. Let's talk. So Jack, we talked about you kicking off because you've just done some awesome research. So tell us, what have you found out?
Well, as you said, we did some research. We fielded research at the end of last year and surveyed mid-market and enterprise companies in the US and Canada, and got some very interesting data. And one of the things we want to talk about is sort of who owns identity and the identity problem for an identity security. And what we're seeing is a trend where identity responsibility has shifted. In the old days, identity was owned by HR because you hired an employee and you need to have HR do all the paperwork and get them onboarded. And then they said, okay, we need an account for this person. And that was really the extent of identities. And then over time, as IT became much more important and we had a lot more systems involved and a lot more complexity, sort of identity responsibility for identity shifted to IT operations. And so now HR hires on boards either a full-time or a contractor, and basically sends a message over to IT operations and says, hey, new person need to have identities, and they need access to 14 of the 38 systems we have in place, or whatever it is, right? And so if you look at this, for the various different types of identity systems we have, whether it's SSO or privileged access management or identity governance, roughly half of the companies today still have IT operations take primary responsibility. Only a small percentage is run by HR. But the other trend we're seeing is now organizations are starting to realize that identity is a security problem as well as an operational problem. And so roughly 20 to 25% of organizations, depending on what type of identity management we're looking at, roughly 20 to 25% of organizations have security being the primary owner of the identity solutions.
Yeah,
and then, and then in some cases, another roughly 20%, it's a joint ownership between multiple groups. Typically, security and IT have shared ownership for it.
Yeah, so identity is a security problem, huh?
Yeah, identity is a security problem. We're
Really?
starting to really, yes, we're starting to understand that. Right. And so, there's lots of examples and lots of data, and we're going to dig into some of it, but we'll just talk about one that I hear that sort of everybody's really aware of: ransomware, right? And what we know is that almost all of the ransomware attacks that have occurred, identity is the primary vector, the primary way the bad guys get in to do ransomware and cause tremendous damage. And because of that, organizations are now coming to the realization that your identity is your digital identity is actually another asset that the company has that needs to be protected and secured, just like the rest of their IT infrastructure. You have network security, you have endpoint security, you have your infrastructure, your storage and your compute stuff and your all these different solutions. Now you have to look at your identity as yet something else that has to be secured and protected and make sure the bad guys can't do anything with.
Yeah.
Yeah. So two really interesting points in the data. I talk with CISOs, security people, and we've seen this movement to where identity has shifted for a lot of organizations and continuing from a HR IT role into now a security role. And in a lot of cases, what that means is they took the Active Directory people and they now report to the CISO, but it's the same people with the same mindsets of enablement as a priority. And we're teaching them security, they're learning, but fundamentally it's about provisioning and enablement and making it go. It's a great trend as far as aligning the organization with the priorities and the risks. But even where organizations now have people in identity reporting to security, there's still sometimes a lot of work to do to tighten up those processes and understandings.
Well, I think our sort of second stat that we've put up here from this research sort of reflects that. Is even though there's this shift to understanding of how important identities are, it's still, as you noted, primarily an operational enablement problem. So when we asked, a bunch of questions about how do you reevaluate your level of access for your employees and your workforce? And 41% of the organizations say the only time they reevaluated the level of access is on a time-based cadence, probably coincidental with audits, right? We get audited and we say, yeah, hey, look, we checked the box. This employee is supposed to have this level of access. And that's not really taking the security frame and the security mindset point of view the way to do this, right? Which is you really need solutions that are looking at this on an almost continuous basis. Is this employee accessing something he should or should not be accessing for every access in the organization?
Yeah.
But it's not, yeah.
And
Go ahead.
And so, look, the majority of organizations are not using any time-based cadence to do this, as expressed in the data. They're using event-driven, right? Some kind of role change, and so event-driven is good too. I think we would suggest that a good cadence would be both role and time-based at whatever frequency you can tolerate. But again, if the reevaluation is okay, does this user need more privileges than they currently have? Yes, we should assign them some more. That's an awful lot of work to go through and look at all their existing privileges and verify that they still need all of those. If nothing's broken, and then I wonder how much of the reevaluation is just about adding privileges as opposed to actually reeling them back.
Yes.
And process, by the way, is driving, right? There's process change that you're sort of reflecting here, Jack. I know your research also talks about where the rubber really hits the road, which is on dollar spend, right? So maybe, I know that's coming up next. Maybe we can move to that. Would that make sense?
Sure.
Because I think ultimately, right, there is this change. Wade talks about the shift to identity teams moving under security because of this realization that, right, this is the number one attack vector. What's happening with spend?
Right. Well, we asked organizations if they were going to spend more in cybersecurity, and the answer is, of course, always yes. We're always increasing our budgets for cybersecurity. And we said, okay, relative to every other area in cybersecurity that you're going to spend, what are you going to do with your identity spending? And identity and access management is going to capture more of that budget. We're going to spend more on this year, we're going to spend more on IAM than we are on, let's say, network security or some of the other things that we've been investing on. And again, that's sort of reflecting this understanding, and it's slow and it's, but it's there that identities are important and we need to secure them. And then we look further in that and said, okay, of that new spend, where is that, that new spend in identity management, where are you going to spend it? And the most significant, the largest area of increased spend is going to be in privileged access management.
That's good, right?
And that is good. One of the things about privileged access management is it's sort of, I sort of call it a freebie in security, in that a huge risk that organizations have is over provisioned and underutilized identities, right? Accounts that have too much access and don't get a lot of use. And those are the accounts that are really of target for the bad guys. That's the ones that they want to come in and find immediately and leverage. And because they're not utilized very much, when you put in place a privileged access management solution, you shut down all of these accounts. You say, hey, this guy hasn't logged in as a super user to this system in 6 months, so clearly they don't need it. So you shut it down and you find out, yeah, if they're not complaining, then they probably didn't need it. You get increased security, sort of, it's sort of a win-win sort of freebie, which is great. And, so because of that, organizations tell us that for most organizations, 90% said PAM is a top 5 security control. All right. And then we look at it and where are they using it, right? 76%, 3/4 of the organizations use it for their employees, right? So they look throughout their employees and their employee accounts and say, let's put PAM in place on these solutions and start restricting access where we don't need it. Almost half the organizations do that for their third parties, their contractors, and about 40% do it for machine identities, for machine workloads. And they use PAM for both monitoring, auditing, and reporting, as well as for discovery and orchestration, right? Automatically removing things that aren't used to say, hey, if an account hasn't been used in 6 months, automatically shut privileges down for that, or something like that, right? So it's getting a lot of use. What's really interesting is despite 90% of organizations using it in all these various different ways for the different types of identities, only 4% of organizations said PAM was their most effective identity solution.
Why is that? I mean, but why, I'm sort of, why is that? Oh, do we know, Jack? I mean, I think, Wade, you probably have an opinion on this, but Jack, I'm interested in your thoughts.
So this is an interesting thing in that, and we'll dive into some of that data in a minute, but privileged accounts aren't the only accounts being used in attacks. And in fact, almost every type of account and every type of identity is being used, and every type of identity related attack is used by bad guys to get in. Because identities are so important, right, that they just are the easiest way for ransomware to get in place and for other attacks to get in, that they're of use. So managing just the privileged accounts doesn't solve the problem.
Yeah, I would actually suggest too, there's a layer in there that's always fun, which is, we use the term privilege to define generally accounts that have more privileges than most, but all accounts have some level of privilege, right? I mean, you can't do anything unless you have the, rights to read the data. That's some level of privilege, right? It goes back to that question of, how we're using a lot of PAM around, privileged accounts. But I love the bottom right-hand corner where there's a little block that says automated discovery. And that's one of the things that we felt like is super difficult. It's like, discovering which accounts are very privileged, which accounts are moderately privileged, how did they get the privilege, where are they using that privilege, right? So this whole idea around, service accounts with interactive login. Okay, well,
Right.
service accounts probably shouldn't have interactive login, but there may be a bunch of them that do. Well, what about which service accounts are being used for interactive login? It's like, okay, that's a different piece of the pie. So that feels, I think, to me, that's one of the things that drives the lack of confidence around PAM being the end all be all. It's a necessary control, absolutely, but your PAM implementation is only as good as your discovery, and discovery, is notoriously not great.
Right. And part of the challenge, when the reason discovery is not great, is with, especially over the last 2 years, with all the changes we've had, we now have a huge explosion of applications and workloads in the cloud. So now you have an environment, a very complex IT environment, where you have SaaS applications, PaaS applications, infrastructure as a service applications, and on-premises applications and data. And every single one of these solutions has its own concept of an identity and its own concept of privileges and access controls and what people are allowed to do and not allowed to do. Some of it is, we're allowed to read or write, and some of it is tied actually to the license level. So it can be very complex to figure out exactly who has access to what, when, and where.
And none of that stuff's being stood up quickly, right? I mean, it's all happening slowly. There's plenty of time to review and sort of make good decisions about privilege escalation for good, without somebody even unintentionally adding more privilege. I think back about, Wade, you've shared this before on one of our webinars, so it's on record, so I'll share it again. You said something that really resonated with me. You said, the first time I get local admin privilege on a box, the first thing I do is I create my own local admin creds so that I make sure I still have local admin access. Somebody might take the other one away from me, and I need local admin on the box. And is a perfect example of, right, the kind of things that, and by the way, I'm guilty of doing the same. I want you to feel.
Oh, I was going to say, Mark, I don't know a single sysadmin who hasn't done that. Right?
Yeah, right.
Everybody does that.
So look, that discovery's got to come around pretty quick.
Right.
Because that exposure is being made. And that's not even one where the identity team probably has the same level of controls they might have of the spinning up of new workloads in Azure, where AD privileges are being extended. So it's a really hard problem, isn't it?
It is. It's a hard problem to solve, and it becomes even harder, as I said, when you look at the complexity of the system, plus the fact that it's not just privileged accounts that are of interest. Any account, anywhere, at any time, as Wade said, accounts have access to data, right? And I mentioned early on in the discussion about ransomware. Well, ransomware started out with the concept of, we'll get access to your systems. If we have write access, we'll encrypt everything and then hold it ransom. Now you have to pay to unencrypt it and get access to it. And there was yet another an agricultural company was just attacked today, and the AGCO, who owns Massey Ferguson and a whole bunch of other tractor companies, is now shut down for at least a couple days because their systems are all shut down. The other part of ransomware that I think people are not as cognizant of is, even if you can't encrypt the data, if you can exfiltrate the data, if you can read data and get that data out of the company, then you can threaten the company and extort it to avoid having that data released publicly, right? So if you have any confidential information, whether it's PII, personally identifying information, names, social security numbers, phone numbers, date of birth, which is critical, and credit card numbers, or if you simply have the corporate information, right? Plans, customer accounts, sales data, financial data, all of that is private information organizations don't want released to the public, and will end up having to pay to ensure, somebody who had read access to the data who shouldn't, right? It could have been an admin who doesn't have a privileged account, but has read access to the corporate accounting data for some reason or another. Now that account gets taken over, and that data gets stolen and is held hostage. And organizations end up paying for that and paying a lot of money to prevent that data going public.
It's funny because maybe that's a good lead in, because I know where you're going next, I think. And so why don't we do that? It's not just the data, I guess, that's being stolen, is it?
No, it is not.
So talk about that. I thought this was fascinating, Jack.
So one of the things we've done repeatedly at ESG with our surveys is we ask security professionals about various different threats they face and what is their level of concern. Are they have a high level concern, moderate level concern, no concern about that particular threat? And very often what we find is that the CISO or the security professional looks at the list of attacks they might be facing and says, are you kidding? Of course we're concerned about that. And they just check the box and say yes, yes, yes to everything. And it's really hard for us to discern what is true concern and they should be worried about versus what they shouldn't be worried about. So in this case, instead, what we said is we asked, have you suffered a breach or attack because of this particular threat? Mm-hmm. And if you haven't, what's your level of concern? And in this case, the highest level of breach or attack, 16% of organizations said that they had been attacked by malware that dumped cache credentials from devices, all right? So a bad person got on the machine and used a tool that's commonly available and said, let me see what's in memory and in the system of, has an admin ever logged onto this machine and not cleared the cache? Yes, then I can get that password, that admin credentials right there, right? So 16% of organizations said they had already been attacked by that. 42% said they're highly concerned about it, and 30% said, well, yeah, maybe we should think about it with moderate concern, right? Now, I want to, before we dive into that a little bit further, I want to contrast that with something else, which is, as I said, we ask this question, we get organizations that say they have a lot of concern. For instance, organizations always tell us they have a lot of concern about zero-day attacks, right? But when you look at the actual data that's collected industry-wide, and most of the cybersecurity organizations publish this data, right? Anywhere from 1 to 4 or 5% of organizations suffer an attack from a 0-day, right? So it's really not fairly common compared to 16% of organizations that suffer this type of attack. Yet they spend tons and tons of money focused on 0-day attacks, right? So we said, are you, if this is a big issue, 16% of organizations say they've suffered this type of an attack and the rest are somewhat concerned, what are you doing about it? Are you actually monitoring your endpoints to see if you have cache privilege credentials there? And only 20% are. And so it's sort of, there's this mismatch of understanding when you compare something like a 0-day attack where we're focusing a lot of effort on something that's rare, and then we're not focusing as much effort on something that's actually much more common. So that's sort of, a concern, and that's sort of, this paradox of not treating identities as something of as a security issue that we really have to be concerned about.
So there we go. Identity is a security problem, huh, Jack?
Identity.
We're back where we started. It's funny, this also brings to light the fact that, we have this, attackers have this unfair advantage, I think, right? So they can be pretty nimble. They can move pretty quickly in the vectors of attack they use, right? We've seen this before. And unfortunately, it seems that attackers have, as we see from the numbers here, attackers, as we've talked about before, Wade, they've moved to using identity as the #1 attack vector, and organizations are recognizing it. But it takes a while for organizations to actually move to action. Right?
Yeah, and I think in fairness to these organizations, looking at these statistics, because these are really important numbers, right? The top end of this is 58%, right? Nearly 60% of organizations either have been, had attacks that have leveraged, memory scraping, or they're very, very concerned about it. It's almost 60%. certainly by the time you toss in some percentage of that 30%, it's easily 60% of organizations that are concerned about this, and yet only a third of that 60% are actually monitoring for this. And I think, in fairness, part of that is due to up until just recently, there haven't been good tools that allowed you to do this. Right. The attacker has great tools to do memory scraping because they're on a beachhead or a 3. Right. And so to scrape that endpoint, I can use Mimikatz or, some local Windows tools, to go poking around and see what's available. But from the security person or the threat and vulnerability person, IT persons, doing continuous analysis of our systems and monitoring for cached credentials is not a simple proposition. And so, in fairness, I think people have had concern, but they haven't had good tools. So, kind of what am I supposed to do?
So I know I know you probably, Wade, you could probably talk about that a bit more, but maybe we should do that. Does that make some sense? Any thoughts before we transition, Wade? I know you've got some details around the problem and with some thoughts on tooling. Should we move there?
Yeah, unless Jack has a last comment there. He looked like he was.
No, I was just going to say, I think it makes sense, right? As you noted, the challenge is you can't attack the particular problem, right? Or sorry, let's use the correct terminology here. You can't defend against an attack if you don't have the defensive tools you need, right? So, looking at the defensive tools is really a good thing.
And attackers are nimble, so they're gonna continue to take advantage until enterprises can can put up their defenses because it works for them.
Yeah, let's jump.
All right, so thanks, Wade.
Yeah, so one of the things we wanted to do was just use a current example attack, and unfortunately for our friends over at Okta, it's a great outfit, does a great job. This particular sample of an attack, this breach, is kind of exemplary of what we see. Mark, you can just go ahead and play the slide out so that we can see the process. And again, full props to Okta. They're great. This is not to pick on them. Lots of other people, 16%, if we're led to believe, have had attacks follow these processes. But here's an example of how it works in the real world. So on the 16th of January, attacker gets access to an initial beachhead through, in this case, RDP. Could have been social engineering or phishing or whatever, watering hole attack, whatever it may be. But they get that beachhead. Then, interestingly enough, what the attacker does is identified local defensive tools on the system, in this case, disabled an EDR that they were able to take a run at. And then this is the sad part of this particular breach, is that we know from the logs, this is all publicly available information. We know from the logs of the endpoint that they actually did an edge search for good memory scraping tools. I forget what the actual phrase was they searched, but so Mimikatz is good at that. Oh, okay. Downloaded Mimikatz and ran it to scrape credentials out of memory from that system and found tools that gave them, and Jack was talking about this earlier, not particularly privileged credentials, but sufficient enough to get access to O365 and then a SharePoint instance, and found a cached file on the SharePoint instance. I believe they're operating at this point purely in user mode, and used that user mode access to get access to a credential file, someone's files listed in a SharePoint system, and then that gave them the ability to create a privileged user in Azure tenant admin account. So again, we see this beachhead scrape. I don't know, Jack, you came off mute. Seems like you had a comment. Certainly want to hear it.
Oh, no. Well, I was going to let you finish the description, but of particular note here is just how quickly they moved, right? And I note that because I think you sort of see two different patterns of attackers. One is an attacker like this that moved quickly through the environment, maybe because they feared that they were going to get caught, so they were trying to do as much as they could, as quickly as they could. And then the sort of the flip side of that coin is the attacker who moves very slowly to try to avoid detection, right? But this happened in a matter of, hours, right? You see, it's, they were able to move from one to the next step very, very quickly. And I think that's sort of another indicator of how important identities are in terms of the security context. And they really are valuable items that need to be protected.
Yeah, I think you're right on. And part of it is the attacker appetite, but also what the attacker found. Like,
right.
if I'm going to exploit 0 days and go through all that, then again, that network traffic might be anomalous, that might be detectable. But if I'm going to access SharePoint using legitimate credentials on this system, the behavioral systems are not going to have a problem with that. It's fast and easy and not going to be particularly strange to any system. And so this method of attack is inherently fast. Like, why not, right? I'm not likely to be detected. I'm going to get access. It's not going to raise bells and alarms and whistles. And so it allows the high speed that it makes it very difficult. Like, I don't need to persist for those old 180-day, persistence metrics. It's 5 days and fight over.
Yep.
Yeah, for a couple of years, you talked about, Jack, earlier, you said, we just don't hear about 0-day exploits that much. And we also don't hear about 180-day dwell times much, right? Remember, that was, I think we're dating ourselves in security, but it wasn't actually that long ago, right? That we were measuring that and, sort of counting on that. And I don't think the attackers are anymore, as evidenced here.
Yeah.
Well, if you're able to gain the credentials you need to go, and then once you have the right credentials, you have the keys to the kingdom, literally the keys to the kingdom. And at that point, if your target is either data exfiltration or ransomware, why not drop it on and get going and do it, right? Because really quick payday and move on to the next victim.
Time is money. Money is time, I guess, right? That's the expression.
Absolutely.
So Wade, you made this point that there's really no good controls in place to catch
Well,
this.
I think this bottom statement here, no real good indicators of compromise, malware. And again, one could argue Mimikatz, a lot of systems would flag that as being, malware, or would have flagged that and put controls against it. But the point is, okay, so that's just one memory scraper. What do you do about someone just using PowerShell, right, to go
AD-Find or any of the other built-in
Windows credential editor, right?
Yeah.
I mean, there's a number of different tools that'll get that job done. And so I think this becomes kind of the driving point. This is incredibly common and not sophisticated, right? I mean, this is not hard to do, and so it's fast.
All right, so they're doing it. How is this how is this possible? We've got PAM in place. We've got MFA in place, right? We've got teams managing Active Directory. How has this happened?
Yeah, and I'll give a quick once through on this, and then obviously I want to hear Jack's perspective on it. He's way down into the data and the details of this. But I think what we've seen from analyzing the data is that the various controls in place are pretty siloed today, right? So, you do the best job with Active Directory you can with Active Directory people, then you lay some PAM over top of that to try to control what are privileged accounts, right? And then in other places where it makes sense to do so, there's some MFA and some single sign-on and whatnot, and it gets to be all very murky very quickly, and it's the gray space between the security controls where security is getting burned, right? So it's like, oh, I'm doing all these things great right up until and we see this all the time, we call it privilege disparity, where we've got a normal Windows user, an Active Directory user, domain user, not particularly privileged, nothing to worry about. We probably don't vault their credential because they're just logging into their host. And then we go looking on their endpoint, And it turns out this is a developer, and most of their work, coding and compiling and whatnot, is done out in the cloud. And this person is caching Amazon command line interface access tokens on their workstation, right? And so it's like, whoa, any attacker that gets hold of that system has, free ride into AWS and access to the source code for whatever applications that they're working on. They can add functionality, they can delete it. There's all kinds of things that are possible. And again, the tools weren't really architected to look for the cross-referencing between the various platforms. Like, how does any of that deal with the local Windows administrator issue, right? Or open privileged RDP session. Someone opens up an RDP session with a highly privileged account, closes the client, but leaves that remote session running, and their RDP user is privileged and allowed to get RDP sessions that last for days or weeks. We've seen lots of that. And so this is why we see this kind of like all these tools could be set up really, really well, and yet security teams and identity teams don't have good visibility into the gray spaces, which allow pretty aggressive high-speed movement in spite of these controls.
Right. Well, one of the things I think you're highlighting is that we have privileged accounts for a reason, because we need that, right? You need to have accounts that have these high levels of privileges to install the software, to make the software run, et cetera, right? And we also have regular users who have legitimate need to access privileged accounts, right? To do their job, whether it's they are a sysadmin or they're a developer that's developing and they need the tokens in order to do their job. They can't do it without that. So then the question is, how do you differentiate between a legitimate user doing something with a privileged account and somebody who steals a privileged user's ID and does something with a privileged account? And it's very hard. And, you can apply, all the AI horsepower in the world, and it's still a very hard problem to solve, to see the behavioral differences in some of those other issues. And this is sort of that gray space that you're talking about, is legitimate users still have needs for privileged access at some points in their workload,
Yeah, and I think, you sort of point out something that, we've talked about a bunch, because I've done a bunch of work in that behavioral space. It really is hard to detect because, administrators' typical behaviors are sort of wildly different every day. And, that makes it pretty hard to find the needle in what is a haystack. And so it's hard. I think the other thing that, and I think really where you're going, wait, next, thinking about time here, because I want to make sure we give you the time you need to wrap up some slides you put together for us. But there's also this problem that it's not even the problem once the identity's been taken, but this issue that these identities are left around, as you talked about, Jack, as the biggest concern in enterprises, that these credentials would be stolen. So it doesn't matter, who's using it. If they're stealing it, if you could stop their stealing it, right, that would solve a lot of the problem. And so, Wade, I can see you probably have something to jump in here with, but I want to be conscious of time as well. So go.
No,
I
think it's a good topic. Access to those credentials. So how do we know if the correct user is using it? Let's just jump to the next chart and talk about it. And at Elusive, we asked that question, right? We, as Jack pointed out, we need privileged accounts. People, need access to data. This is the whole point of having a network and access to, systems. We can get work done. So one of the things that we did, at Elusive, is we went out and worked with our existing customers, which are in many cases very sophisticated security and identity organizations, and did kind of an audit of what they had. 27 different organizations, nearly 1 million endpoints in total. But those organizations had a variety of sizes, all the way down to 2,000 endpoints at the smallest side and 90,000 on the larger side. And what was what was interesting was just the consistency in the findings, the kinds of things that we found and the rates of them. 100% of organizations had service accounts that are at risk of being identified resident on various systems and leveraged either past the hash, Kerber roasting, you know, all kinds of potentials there. 87% of the local administrative accounts, so the local SAM admin accounts are not being managed. That number blew me away. Honestly, I expected, you know, 30%, 20%, 87%. This is an extremely difficult facet to manage. And as Jack pointed out, and ransomware operators are particularly well aware of this. And so they know how to leverage unmanaged local Windows administrators. 100% of organizations have shadow administrator risk. So I have yet to lose this bet, which is, you know, going into an assessment. Hey, you know, how do you think you're going to do on shadow admin? Meaning, do you have confidence that you know who your privileged users are? You can give me a list of who's privileged and how privileged are they? And the answer is no, most organizations can't, right? There are users that have high privileges that they've gotten in non-standard ways. Maybe it's through direct ACLs, maybe it's through nested group privileges, so that people have privileges in ways that we're not expecting. And the result of all of this stuff is that there's residue laying around the network, easily discoverable by attackers that are exposed, right, to insiders, attackers, malware, and this is super consistent. So it's interesting from Jack's numbers about the concern that people have, and yet the note here that, you know, they're not scanning for privileged identities laying around in memory or cached or whatnot, and then sure enough, this is what we see when we go looking.
But by the way, it's sort of funny timing that there's maybe it's not funny that we're saying that organizations don't realize this. I don't know if you guys can see the chat window. There is some questions that have come in, and I'm cognizant of the time here because we probably want to wrap this up in a few minutes to let people go back to their day jobs. But as much as we're probably could talk for days, I don't think that's the intent of our audience. But there is a question here that says, you know, my security team has become aware of how cache credentials and admin privileges are being used in ransomware attacks, but we don't think we have the, you know, solutions in place to find them. Where do we start? So maybe that's a way we could transition in the last couple of minutes, Wade, for you to move from the problem. What do folks do? What should they do?
Yeah, I think the solution, we've seen it evolve. There's two sides to the solution. There's scanning and auditing the identity structures, right? There's looking at Active Directory, Azure Active Directory, the PAM solutions, and saying, okay, what's the policy? What are the plans? What are we trying to do? Who has privilege? How did they get it? Looking at that side of the house. But the other side of the house, the essential element is doing this continuous, you know, daily, weekly at the least, endpoint based, you know, workstation and server audits to look for cache credentials, access tokens, and this kind of information that's so easily identified. Attackers, you know, do this, and we need to do it. And I think any solution that doesn't have that top down, let's look at the directory structures, look at the policy engines, but then also that bottom up, let's go looking at the hosts and look at what's cached. You're never going to get ahead of this problem until you build a cadence. It's like what we did with vulnerability scanning, right? You're going to address the vulnerability issue. Yes, you have to have patch management, but you can't run patch management without doing vulnerability scanning. And it's the same thing around privileged identities. We've got to transition to a continuous identity audit of the endpoints, looking for that residue in order to build programs to remediate those conditions.
And I think you're right. There really hasn't been good tooling. This aligns with what you know, the question that was chimed in here. And I know we really could go on for days talking about this. And I do want to give you know, sort of wrap this up. And Wade, if you don't mind, what I'd like to do is real quickly here. Obviously, this is what Elusive does, right? Maybe you can talk to us a little bit about this.
Yeah, look, that's the point, is to leverage this kind of capability into what Jack was talking about, and help security teams, identity teams kind of mature their understanding of their own posture. And so you're looking at elusive identity intelligence, dashboard, and it gets us automatic prioritization of these kind of identities. Where do we have shadow administrators, right? Who are the shadow administrators? What do they shadow? How did they get at that? And then where are those credentials cached throughout the environment, right? Who sits outside of password policy? What privileged identities are not being managed? And then what are we doing about solving those problems? You look down in the bottom right hand corner, look at the remediation engine, right? And so what kind of remediations are we using to solve this problem? Are we just having elusive clean the credentials and identities off of endpoints after they've been used so they're no longer present? That's a primary way. We can certainly do that. We've got some deceptive capability where it makes sense to do that as well. But in a lot of cases, we're feeding other solutions, right? So we're using Azure and other platforms to enforce MFA. We're doing a better job informing the organization which accounts should be onboarded into PAM, or disabling unmanaged local Windows administrators. And so this is really the idea, is to give a capability for continuous audit and assessment, but then also remediation of these conditions. We don't want to just create visibility about problems and not give you the tools to solve it, Mark. So that's the option here.
Yeah, it sort of you brought back this recollection of the days when vulnerability management for exploits suddenly became the hottest thing, 2015 maybe. And look, you can't fix these problems if you can't find them, right? And so it starts with discovery, starts with kind of an understanding of what needs to be resolved, prioritizing those, remediating them, and really stopping attackers from getting the keys, literally here, so that we put them back to 180 days, not 5, and maybe longer. I'm sensitive about time here, so let's wrap this up. Any last thoughts, Jack and Wade, to leave with our attendees today?
Well, I'd say, one of the things you talked about just now, which I think is really important, is that whole concept of you can't protect what you don't know about. And if we think about identities as yet another item in the IT infrastructure that needs to be protected, we have to understand all the identities we have, right? So, that's sort of that first challenge, that discovery and that knowledge of what identities we have, and then what privileges do those identities have, and then sort of step by step work out from there. And I think it's sort of, for anybody new to this and just saying, okay, oh my God, now I have, you've exposed me to another problem, what do I do? And as with everything else, you start with discovery and take it one step at a time.
I think it's good advice. Any thoughts, Wade?
Yeah, I would say, look, this is really good news, right? Attackers have had tools and automation that allows them to quickly discover on their beachheads what identities can be leveraged and for what purposes. And now security organizations have that same capability, not just what they've gotten up till now, which is like pen test results or red team results, maybe running some localized tools to get a sample, but now there's an ability to do this throughout the entire environment and consistently. And what we find is that when we employ systems like this, it actually reduces the workload for the other teams, because you're simply denying. Remember all the work that went away when DDoS protection became something that was actionable and functional, right? A whole lot of work went away when those kind of tools kind of came online, and this is the same kind of opportunity. So it's actually good news.
Wade, you just kicked off what could be another 45-minute discussion on reducing security efforts through really good hygiene, right? Going back to the basics of managing our environments so that they're in a posture position so that they have less risk to have to detect, and instead can be more confident that they really are providing least privilege access, not only to users, but also to the attackers who, right, masquerade as users. Look, this is fun, guys. We did it, Jack. We've been talking about doing this webinar for a while.
Wow.
I really enjoyed speaking with you guys today. Thank you for the sharing of the research, Jack. I mean, the research about endpoint credential stealing is really interesting. I think it points out that you know, the days of thinking it's just sort of brute forcing passwords is no longer, right. The attackers have got tooling, they can do better, and they are doing better. And your association to that with ransomware, I think, is really compelling. Wade, as always, your insights on you know, sort of how do organizations deal with this, your stories of what you've seen in organizations are always fun. We should do this again at some point. I think it would be a lot of fun.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And I think, look, for those folks who want to know more about ESG's research, Jack, you did a lot of research, more than what you shared here today. Here's Jack's email and where you can find Jack and ESG_global. We've also put Elusive's website here, find out about white papers on the types of risks and how Elusive has been used in organizations to find them, give visibility, and then automatically remediate them. There's also an opportunity to do an identity risk assessment for free and get an assessment of the kinds of risks that may be exposed in your environment. So that, I think that's some call to actions for those of you who found this helpful. Feel free to continue your journey. Unfortunately, our journey on this call ends. Thank you for joining. Hope it was helpful. Stay tuned for our next webinar. Have a good day, everybody.
Awesome. Thanks, Jack.
Thank you, folks.